Record, Joe has just joined it.
Oh, fantastic.
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, we can hear you. Can we see you? There we are. Hello, you're very welcome, Joe. Now I've lost you again.
Oh, I can see you. Everyone okay?
You can see everyone okay. Well, Joe, thank you. Joe's had a little bit of a problem joining us, jumping, but you are here eventually, and you are very welcome, Joe. Joe, professor in Harvard, author of The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. And I can tell you, Joe, reading your book was so exciting for me because it was a little bit like as a history undergraduate when I had that dawning of, oh my God, history is only the history that was written by the people who write the history. And then we discover women's history, and then we discover letters written by people from America, and they're not writing because they don't want to upset people at home, so they don't write the truth. So this highlight of, oh my God, you know, the samples that we have are by the literate population, a fascinating insight into societies. And I'm going to hand straight over. Usually, Joseph, I'd put a few questions myself, but I'm going to hand straight over to Prakash Sharma, my co-host, who's going to take over with questions. And then we also have Elena Halonen here with us, founder of Square Peg in the Netherlands, who is going to follow on from Prakash with a few questions. So thanks very much for joining us, Joe, and I'll hand straight over to Prakash.
Sure, great to be with you.
Thank you so much, Louise. Joe, a warm welcome to the Behavioral Science Club. This is a group of people who are enthusiastic about behavioral science, which means among us, you will have people, and it happens most of the time, we have someone who joins in for the very first meeting because he or she heard about nudge or heard about irrationality, the irrational brain, or heard something about design thinking. So there's something very interesting. What is it I want to find out? So we have people who are right there, almost at the first chapter of the book, any book of behavioral science. And then the range goes on almost all the way to people who are right now pursuing their PhDs, double PhDs, people who are professors, people who are writers, to people who run applied behavioral science consultancies. So that's the entire range in which the audience typically is. So what we do typically is we invite the guest to just say something about their book or their life journey. And from there is basic question answers around there. And sometimes the questions are very much confined to the book that they wrote. Sometimes it spills over to the overall larger world. And I'm very excited because I have been getting a lot of messages about you. People have been very excited. Some of us have been waiting for 6 months almost. Because some of them were expecting you to be there at the Now Fest in September. And I had to tell them that I have to disappoint them because I reached out to you quite late in September when your book had come out, and you're very busy and we could not talk. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have quickly 1-2 questions and then open it up for everybody because it's not right for me to keep on talking. So around 500, 600 years back, Martin Luther King, he wrote down his 99 Theses. He goes and pastes it on the church's door. And now 400, 500 years have passed by, and the way your brain is quite different from your forefathers who lived around that time in Europe too. So how did this change happen? What is the connection between Sola Scriptura, 99 Theses, and our brains today?
Yeah, so that's actually, it's a way that I opened the book by focusing on Protestantism. Actually, a lot of the story is about how you get to such an individualistic religion as Protestantism. And some of the key things I wanted to show is how cultural practices and beliefs, including religious beliefs, can shape our biology, without shaping our genetics. So one of the unfortunate ways we tend to think about things is by being dualistic, that we tend to think of culture and learning as one set of things, and then biology and physiology is another set of things. But it's increasingly clear from fields like cultural neuroscience that when we learn things, including when we culturally learn from others, that changes the physical substructure of our brain. So the case of reading is an example, because with the spread of Protestantism, Protestants held, at least some of the Protestants of the era, held a strong belief that everyone, women and men, should learn to read the Bible for themselves in order to develop a personal relationship with God. And this led for the first time to widespread literacy across the population. And what we know from neuroscience is that when people learn to read, they get a thicker corpus callosum, they get specialized circuitry in their left ventral hemisphere, they get a longer verbal memory, they probably have reduced facial recognition. So it has both psychological effects on basic things like facial recognition, but also changes in the physical substructure. So we can imagine, we don't have the data, of course, but as reading is spreading across Europe, corpus callosa, the information highway that connects the left and right hemispheres, are thickening. So there are physiological changes to the populations as this religious belief that requires you to learn to read spreads across Europe and eventually the world.
What a lovely introduction. So, Joe, there were a couple of questions more that I have, but I also understand there are a lot more people, a lot more questions out there. So, in the interest of making sure no one is unhappy with me, one quick question out here is with this whole idea of, or let me put it like this. A few days back, I was watching The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and he was covering the farmers' protests in India. And he went on to contrast that the protest which is happening in India, almost 600 people are more or less a part of it. And then he goes on to contrast the world of Twitter in US and says, right now we're all trending and talking about Jack Snyder's Justice League cut, and everyone is right now going gaga about the Joker's new look. But if you look at the larger world, what people are talking about right now is cultivation wheat rice. But we are led to believe that the biggest thing in the world right now is Jared Leto's Joker look. And so if I have to bring the same question out, they're saying we have been reading books on psychology, all our theories for quite some time, and that has shaped the way we look and interpret our world. But if we had to bring in all the other 600 million people's equivalent into the world of psychology, how would the world of psychology, how would world look like?
Yeah, so you mean if we tried to build a theory of psychology or build a field of psychology that took into account all of humanity? Is that the question?
There's the question, and is that even possible? Or is there, or you could also turn the question and say, is there something wrong with the existing model at all? Like this whole divide of, it is almost fashionable also to say weird versus non-weird, as if they're separate species altogether. So where is the truth exactly?
Yeah, so well, the first thing, my colleagues and I, Steve Heine and Aaron Zion, we wrote this paper in 2010 called The Weirdest People in the World. And back then, it's the same title as the book, except there's no question. The paper has a question mark, and the book is more confident. And that used the term weird as a kind of consciousness-raising device. And the idea was to raise the consciousness of behavioral scientists, including psychologists and behavioral economists and other folks, that the samples that they were drawing their insights from were not only one slice among a great diversity, but at least on a lot of the dimensions that are important to psychologists, the kind you'll find in the textbooks. The population they were sampling tended to be at the extreme end of the distribution. And then, of course, my own effort to explain this in the book is really, sees this dimension, this psychology as multidimensional, as varying continuously, as non-essential, changing over time. But there's something about the acronym where sometimes people get the opposite impression as to the actual enterprise that's underway. So I wrote a previous book to this, published in 2016 called The Secret of Our Success. And that's kind of a prequel to The Weirdest People in the World. And there I try to lay out an evolutionary approach to humans and culture, which posits lots of interesting areas of human nature. So of course, in The Weirdest People in the World, I talk about incest aversion and kinship and pair bonding. I think you could put in friendship there, lots of aspects of social status, so prestige and dominance. All of these things are key aspects. There's lots of emotional or affective reactions that you can find across human societies and in non-human primates as well. So there's lots of areas of shared human nature where we look similar. The question is having a research program that can theorize and explain those, the variation, seek that within an evolutionary framework, because it's my view that's the best way to understand people. And then, of course, that was going to require both historical work and work across diverse societies.
Thank you so much, Joe. For people who are here from the Asian countries, I have a lot more questions, guys. There are questions around why there might be a difference between my folks who actually grow paddy versus your folks who are more like the wheat cultivation guys, and why my folks might be more prone towards not looking as nepotism as something bad. But in the interest of time, I will not ask those questions. But what I'll do right now is I'll invite in Elena. Elena is a special co-host for us today. She's joining us from Netherlands. She actually was the one who introduced you to your work, Joe, during the office time. And I would like to invite her over right now to share her questions with you. Leah?
Thank you, Prakash. Hi, Joe. It's very nice to sort of meet you. I also have a couple of questions. So it's really great that there's finally more awareness and recognition of the weirdness of psychology. Do you think there's any danger that the term unintentionally creates some kind of othering or essentializing and overshadows the nuance that we should consider within countries as well?
Right. So, I mean, I guess there's a danger. We worked hard in the original 2010 paper to undermine both of the elements you mentioned. One is we emphasize, as does the book, that lots of this variation occurs at a much more micro level. So in the book, you know, that I look at variation within India, I look at variation within China. A lot of the analyses are just looking at variation, say, within Italy or within European countries. Yeah. So that's part of the research problem. Although sometimes when people just kind of skim the surface of these ideas, they see cross-national variation. And the other thing about the term, it was, I mean, in some sense, it's constructed to hold up a mirror and to reverse the other perspective, to make the weird people the other, right? Because if you look at the Weird People paper in 2010, it opens with a story about some folks in New Guinea, and it sets the reader up to think, oh, you're about to say how unusual these New Guineas are. And then it flips the mirror around and says, actually, the reader, the weird people who are unusual in a global and psychological perspective. Yeah. So it's, I mean, the whole design was to not do that. So it's interesting that people are still saying that it does that a bit.
I think there is a group of people who have read the first book and maybe some of the second book, but what happened with Thinking Fast and Slow is a lot of people get through the first 50 pages and not get any further. It can happen. The term spreads, but not the depth of it. Quite a sort of tricky question. Most, if not all, of the research methods in psychology originate in weird countries, like Likert scale and surveys and even qualitative methods, but especially quant research and experimental methods. But that reflects the Western analytical mindset and approach to breaking things down into component parts. What do you think that means for psychology and how we can learn about human nature and decision making if even our methods are weird, like all of our methods?
Yeah, so I'm sensitive to that, and one of the main points of the penultimate chapter discusses innovation, and in that chapter, one of the key ideas is the value of cognitive diversity, the fact that different minds that are psychologically different in interesting ways are more likely to generate new ideas, and then that feeds into creating new recombinations and can drive innovation. So I think we should take advantage of the available cognitive diversity. One of the things I've tried to do in my work is, you know, I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, right? So I cut my teeth going off to the Peruvian Amazon or to living with remote groups in rural Chile and just doing rich qualitative ethnography. So I've always seen rich qualitative ethnography as part of the toolkit that social sciences have to use. I have some students I generated while I was in the psychology department at UBC, people like Ayanna Willard and Rita McNamara, who now use ethnography along with psychological methods to make progress. But of course, when it comes down to actually publishing, you know, if you're going to publish in a mainstream psych journal, mostly you have to speak the language of the psychologist. That's how I think of it as an ethnographer. So you present your analysis of variance or your 2x2 or whatever the appropriate thing is. But you know, in my books and things like that, I try to bring in the ethnography as much as possible. And one of the things you can get from that are new ways of thinking about things. Now, when scientific journals might find that, you know, be more open to that, it's unclear. I think people are seeing, at least the people I'm talking to, are seeing more value in understanding the details of life along with running the regression. So if you're writing for economists or something, you speak in regressions. So yeah, I think the key is to tap into the psychological diversity and to incorporate ethnography, you know, in teaming up with the people you're studying as part of that.
I have one more question that actually ties up with what you were just saying. You've also been previously a professor of psychology and economics, and a lot of the books, and actually how this book club has come about as well, is the popularity of behavioral economics in the practitioner world or commercial sector. How do how do we adjust the knowledge that we are using on sort of day-to-day or in practical terms in the commercial sector when we kind of know that a lot of the behavioral economics literature is weird? How do we adjust that? What can we do?
Well, there are two big approaches which I would recommend. The first is the obvious one, which is to you need to verify that these biases and judgmental heuristics and whatnot that you'll find in behavioral economics, that they are actually applicable and generalized beyond the populations that they've been typically studied. Some will, I expect some to, and I think that some won't. And we already know, I point out a couple in the book. Richard Nesbitt has a book called The Geography of Thought, where he points out some more. Things like the endowment effect don't generalize. It's weaker in Japan than it is in the US, and it's non-existent amongst mobile foragers. So they have to be recalibrated. The next thing I would say, that I have this paper called A Problem in Theory with Michael Muthu-Krishna at the LSE. And we think that psychology needs more theory. That I think this theory can be extended to behavioral economics as well, in the sense that if we have an evolutionary theory and we can say, look, we see this heuristic in non-human primates, and we can understand when people should be using the heuristic, like my work on conformist transmission, we can predict when and where people should rely on conformity from the theory. So that could also give us more confidence that we can generalize.
Great. Apparently I can ask one more question. So it's been 10 years since weird was coined, and although some progress has been made, there's still a lot to do. I think it might have even been your paper recently that was talking about that there's a lot of work to do. What do you think are the biggest achievements or the progress that's been made in the last 10 years? And what do you think the next 10 years will look like? It's a big question for, hypothesizing, but,
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been, I don't know whether it was caused by our paper or at least was concurrent with an increase in the number and intensity of experimental and other kinds of research being conducted in diverse societies. So the place where I've seen the biggest and I'm most optimistic about is within economics, not actually behavioral economics. So that seems to have gone the other way. When I first started behavioral economics, I mean, I was working with people like Colin Cameron and Ernst Fair, and so I felt like we were a behavioral economics movement. But then that subgroup of economics lost interest. But the people who do development, so development economists, economic historians, and that group have really latched onto this stuff. And that's in the cultural economists. And that has been where a lot of the great insights have come. The one exception who is kind of a mainstream behavioral economist is Alman Falk at Bonn. And he's done this recent paper in the QJE where, he has 80,000 people in 76 countries studying a number of different economic preferences using a survey methodology. And so that really shows extensive variation along lots of important dimensions that economists care about. So good in the sense that there's been a lot of projects, but bad if you actually look at the proportion of subjects that are weird, it's still in the 90s, right? 95, 96%. And my take on why psychology has been slow to adapt is because the incentive structure isn't there. So in developmental economics, the incentive structure switched so that doing this kind of work can be incentivized. But in psychology, and especially with the replication crisis, you still need to get a lot of subjects quickly, and you've got to be pumping out papers as a graduate student to make yourself marketable. Other disciplines don't have that. So this is something that's emerged within psychology that creates this treadmill for faster and faster data. And you're like the mouse running on the wheel.
Yeah. One addition to that, I think in the last year, especially last spring, since last spring and the Black Lives Matter, I don't want to call it movement, but that when that was in the spotlight, there was a lot more psychology isn't just weird, but there's another, there's potentially another W at the beginning, and the subjects are, also very, very white. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, people say that, but I mean, one of the points of the talking about this cultural stuff is that when you study, Americans with all different skin pigmentations, they still look pretty weird. So it's easy to find evidence that it's not about skin color actually. Now, as a kind of statistical matter, it's still the case that because lots of undergraduates are white, that you end up with a disproportionate share of the subject pool. But it's easy to show it's not a skin pigmentation issue in terms of psychology.
I think the argument is that there's a different life history, like a different life history or life path. I think that's kind of the gist of it. I think it was there was some discussion even the APS or somewhere. I don't remember the details now, but yeah, I think it may be a class or sort of an intersectional problem with class. So yeah, thank you very much.
Now, just a point on that. I mean, in the original 2010 paper, one of the things we emphasized was that there were differences in psychology based on SES if you just looked at American samples. So that's something we highlighted back in 2010.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Alina. I invited Alina on today because I was aware that she was very familiar with the book, and I was really interested to have her here to put her questions to Joseph. And before we take the questions that are coming up from the members here, for those of you who aren't familiar with Joe's book, I'd just like you, Joe, to maybe iterate for the members the three striking conclusions that you came to with your colleagues when you decided to compile the cross-cultural studies, because it will really help to iterate really the whole essence of the book.
Sure. So, and one of the key questions that we focus on comes out of that, which is that not only is psychological variation, very substantial psychological variation around the world, along dimensions that seem to be important in the behavioral sciences, both to economists and psychologists, but that the populations most frequently studied by psychologists and economists are often at the extreme end of the distribution, anchoring the far side. So not only is can you not easily generalize, but you might be generalizing from a particularly unrepresented sample. And these seem to be not only so there's this sense that there's somehow basic aspects of psychology and some are more superficial aspects of psychology. But you can find this in tension and memory and visual processing. So we opened the Weird People paper with visual illusions. We put one in, and some people have challenged that. But I can reel off 4 or 5 more easy that are already in the literature showing variation. So I mean, maybe there's some sensible thing that can be said about basic aspects of psychology, but people's intuitions, folk psychological intuitions about what the basic categories are, doesn't seem to capture the right angle. So, and then what the book's about, it takes off from that question and tries to explain some of this psychological variation. So I developed a theory to explain that and try to defend the theory. And then I'm also interested in how this links to Adam Smith's original question. So can we explain the rise of Europe, the Industrial Revolution, and the wealth and poverty of nations by recognizing that there's interesting psychological variation?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph. And of course, the insightful comment that even if we were to bring in the Asian groups of students in to take part in the research. The fact is they're still literate students, so they still then become part of that group. Just clarifies it so well. Now we have had lots of questions coming in from the members, and I'd like to now pass over to Kathleen, who's an anthropologist herself. Kathleen, would you like to put your question to Joseph?
Hi, yes. My master's is archaeology, paleoanthropology, and my doctorate is biological anthropology. And I've taught a wide variety of anthropology courses for 30 years. So I unfortunately didn't have a chance to read your book, but I did watch you on several very long interviews. So I think I have a grasp of it. I'm going back to the archaeological history now. For your development of the weird hypothesis, I do think, you know, it's done with Mesopotamia, the rise of Mesopotamia, the, you know, someone was like, you have God in it. Yes, it makes a difference. With Mesopotamia had the urbanization and trade was very tightly controlled by a religious king kind of kinship there. And it was very tribal. And over time, it did transition to a very rigid, moralistic, monotheistic tradition, which then eventually leads to the Catholicism and the development of the weird European. I think that works for that, and I think your explanation is good for that. But at the same time that there was the Mesopotamian civilization rising, there was a much larger, much different civilization that was also rising in the Indus Valley. And the Indus Valley civilization was a larger geographic area, was not militaristic, was much more urbanized, had a much bigger trade route, and has absolutely no evidence of an organized religion controlling anything. And that was also, I would say, a more influential civilization. The concept, the religion, which we associate with India, and I hope that I'm kind of touching on where Prakash was maybe wanting to ask some questions here. The religion of India doesn't come in until about with Hinduism that we associate with India, doesn't come in until about 600 years after the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization. And it is not, my understanding, and I have very teeny understanding of this, but it is not moralistic. It is more on empathy. And it is not, cousin marriage was evidently a big part of your hypothesis. It is not, cousin marriage is not a big thing. And so I think that if you look at what was going on in India all this time, India was far more advanced than the European region, and more scientific. And does it fit? Or is it a different weird, or what? And that's kind of what I'm asking, because I find that we have a large percentage of members are South Asian. And I don't think it works, or it works in a very different way. And so I'm hoping I'm kind of touching on where Prakash was wanting to ask on this.
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. And I'm very interested in India too. We've done some work on this in my lab. And so one of the things we're taking advantage of is the variation in wheat versus rice that runs on an east-west axis in India. And we can even get it at a fairly micro sort of sub-state level. And we can take the amount of rice or wheat in an area, use that to predict cousin marriage. There's lots and lots of cousin marriage. And then we can link that to all kinds of economic outcomes. So the theory does work pretty well in India, at least at that level, that there are ecological factors. So in this case, it's not the church. So one of the points of the book is that lots of things affect the nature of kinship systems. One of them was this, particular brand of Christianity, but we should expect lots of other ecological factors to matter. And one of the demands of paddy rice agriculture versus wheat. So you get relatively more intensive kinship in the rice areas, and then that seems to have some of the downstream effects. We're still looking for we have economic data. I'd rather have psychological data. Thomas Talhelm has shown psychological data. He links the rice to things like analytic thinking and nepotism in business and things like that. So we tried to test it in India, and I think that in terms of, we tried to test some of the religious ideas, and we do seem to get some of the religion effects that we would expect from Hinduism that seem to parallel things that we find in Christianity. So at least at an operational level, it seems to have some of the downstream effects on getting people to behave in consistent with the norms, consistent with the pro-social norms.
Okay. I just think that it's the background. I mean, your whole, my understanding is your whole thing is based on how Mesopotamia, monotheism, Catholicism, and that is so different from what was going on throughout the archaeological historical time period of India.
Right.
And I just think, well.
So I just want to say, there's nowhere in the book where I draw a line from Mesopotamia through Catholicism. So the main case that I make.
Well, that must have been from one of your video talks that you gave.
The case that I make in chapter 4 is that, and chapter 3, is that with the evolution of human societies, humans began, lots of human groups, as they had domesticated agriculture, began to develop intensive kinship. Intensive kinship includes cousin marriage, but that's just one element in a much larger package. It includes things like inheritance customs, clans, kindreds, polygyny, and a whole package of things that creates tighter social networks so that people can galvanize more cooperation. And then I layer on top of that, as societies scale up, one of the things that led to more success in competition with other groups was a religious system that gets people, that extends the boundaries of human cooperation. So you can have a moralizing God that can do that, but you can also have notions of karma that do that. So my former student, who I mentioned a little while ago, named Diana Willard, has studied this in Singapore and shown how karma beliefs can have the same effect as a moralizing God. So this is just a sort of general theory about how societies scale up in complexity. A key point from that section is that at the base of these societies are still in forms of intensive kinship. People still rely on their families, extended kin networks for marriages as a source of identity, as old age security, as insurance against injury. So it's this foundation of intensive kinship that then, when we get this peculiar thing in Europe where one particular brand of Christianity, not Christianity in general, undermines that intensive kinship, that it sends Europe down a route of sociocultural evolution that you don't see in other societies because of the dissolution of the intensive kinship that has been so important in more complex societies around the world.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, and thanks for that very extensive answer, Joseph. I think that Prakash just wants to build on that a moment, so I'll just hand over to you, Prakash.
Thank you, Louise, Kathleen. And thanks, Latitude and Mariah. I know you guys waiting in line, so please bear with me for like a minute or two. The professor, our work needs us to work a lot with people, companies, and so, I mean, folks from India, right? We are based out of Bangalore, India. And there are something very interesting if we look at our works. In the sense, let's say we're talking fundraising and charity. And if you look at people who come from following Islam as a religion, following Christianity as a religion, right? Or Hindu as a religion. Now, all three of them have donating or charity inbuilt as some sort of a guidance, with the 1/10th part of Christianity, what you call zakat in Islam, and punya kamana in Hinduism, which is earning the good grace, right? But if you look at the donation patterns across these three religions, what is interesting for us is people who are followers of Islam and Christianity are also very willing to donate to foundations and charities. But if you look at the Hindu guy, right, he's going to be willing to donate an insane amount of money, but to God, not to the person, not to a charity. He wants to donate it to God, because what is inbuilt in the system is, if I donate it to God, it comes back to my life manifold somewhere, right? So what happens for us then is, we are not always able to map 1:1 findings from literature to our work. And that was how we got very, very curious about maybe there is something more to it. Maybe there is no need to discount the Eastern philosophy and only look at the Western philosophy and find the balance. So this is the background where we are sort of at. Here's the question. So each society, if you look at the slice of time where it exists, right, because of the time that it exists in, it has a certain question, certain demand of the people who live in that times. And as you pointed in your book, demands of the time, demands of culture shapes the way society is thinking or functioning. The psychology of people who live there changes. And right now, East is going through a massive change. India is. And in this changed society, we do not have these books or these guidelines that will be available to someone who's working in a Western society, who can look at those books and say, all right, this is how psychology works out here. So for people in the East, we do not have that available easy framework. So the question now is, in one sentence, what is the best way for people in the East? And I see a lot of people out here, people who are brand managers, people who are marketers, people who are from the academic world. What is the best way forward for us to map our own psychologists to our own cultures? I know it's a big question, but that was the best way I could put it.
You mean, so, I mean, that's obviously a great research enterprise, is to try to develop those findings, those sets of insights, and compile them, gain confidence in them, understand the nature of the variations. So that's, from my view, that's one of the projects that the field of psychology or behavioral economics, this kind of interspecies between those, should be working on. So I've been trying to inspire more people to do that kind of work, and some people have. So there's been some progress on that. But yeah, so I mean, I've been trying to put the scientific pressure on them. I'm not sure if there are other market forces that could be brought to bear. But
so, what becomes the best way? Like, I know you talk a lot about in-depth qual, alternative research to go out there. Are you recommending folks from the East eventually put up their own version? I mean, I know right in the beginning in the book, you say, what would psychology look like if the Japanese were the ones who had developed psychology first?
I think that would be great. I mean, so one of the things that I make fun of psychologists for is, if you look at textbooks, it's a social psychology textbook when it's about weird people, and it's a cultural psychology textbook if it's about anybody else, right? So all the findings from Japan and East Asia and the Middle East and Africa all go in my friend Steve Heine's cultural psychology textbook, and everything else goes in the social psychology textbook. So that's the problem. And so there's no reason why you couldn't say, you know, we want to write a textbook that gives us the best understanding we have for India or for East Asia or something like that. And, you know, that seems like, I mean, that's already been done, right? The book that's called Social Psychology is actually the social psychology of weird people.
Thank you so much, Joe. That is very encouraging. In fact, I know one, two people who are working on the project right now, and maybe I'll ask them to get in touch with you if you would be kind enough to agree with which time. Thank you. Mariah, please go ahead with your question. I know you've been waiting for some time.
Oh, good. So I don't have the pedigree of Kathleen or yourself, Professor. I collected a few bachelor's degrees, and my first one was mechanical engineering, then nutrition, then nursing. I'm just an entrepreneur. I jump from one thing to another as I find things. So now I'm on my master's degree in finance at Cornell. I love numbers and I love that aspect of my business. And so I'm continuing with my entrepreneurship spirit. The question that I had for you is, 500 years ago, we've noticed a shift, and that was based on a group of people that actually split from the Catholic Church. nowadays in our society, we see that Silicon Valley, which surprisingly is based in the West, has split from the rest of the society and has brought in a whole bunch of products that the rest of the world is now taking. So how do you look at that? Is that another shift that psychology has not detected, or what are we going to see as a result of that? Because obviously they dominate.
So you mean a shift because of the technologies like the internet?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was just very rapidly exported to the rest of the world. But in the same way, you know, the literacy and the schooling that actually comes from, you know, Martin Luther and the Protestants is really what drove the spread of a universal schooling around the world, right? It's the germ of that. It diffused into secular society. Now it's the responsibility of governments, but really schools are spread. They begin this process with the spread of Protestantism. I talk about in the book how they first spread into Scotland, and that may have midwifed the Scottish Enlightenment. So, I mean, so you're out of my area, and you're asking me to speculate wildly on the implications of information technology. One thing that, assuming we can continue to cooperate, there's a cooperative problem of bad information that goes along with this information technology, because there's an incentive to give bad information to manipulate others. So that's a classic cooperative dilemma that's just remanifests itself on the internet. But assuming that good information can be sorted out from bad, it should increase the rate of innovation. So that's a potentially bright side, because one of the key ideas in The Weirdest People in the World and in my previous book is that new ideas are formed by the recombination of diverse ideas from different minds. So the more different minds you can link in, pass ideas around, create new recombinations. That should change people's psychology. But one of the things I'm worried about with these new technologies is trust. So with things like taking a taxi cab versus taking an Uber, you know, there's a way in which the transaction is protected in the electronic world. I mean, obviously there's ways to hack it and exploit it, but it's not, you don't have a brief relationship with the taxi cab driver built on trust. You know, it used to be that the cab driver didn't know if you're going to pay him when you got to the end, and he had to just kind of hope. And then there's, of course, tipping and things like that. But the electronic systems seem to take a lot of that out of it. And I worry about it affecting interpersonal trust. And people will just rely on these electronic and formal mechanisms to guarantee contracts rather than relying on good old-fashioned human trust. So I worry about that dipping as a consequence.
So to say, I mean, I understand where you're coming from with trust, and I agree with that. But that's an opportunity for an entrepreneur to add the virtual reality software and have stories about these different cab drivers, so that when you choose your cab through Uber, you could actually pick and read the stories and then pick the one that resonates to you. It's an opportunity. And as an entrepreneur, I look at that and go, you want trust? I'll give you trust. You know, what do you want?
Yeah.
You know, that's it.
That sounds like that's a good idea to put out there and watch the recombination and you know, let it compete.
Right. I mean, I'm not an Uber, but you know, anyway, I wanted to say something about Kathleen, a debate about wheat and rice, because one of my bachelor's degrees, well, it has 3 majors because I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted, but it has a food and health and nutrition component. And so when you look from a nutritional component, an analysis of the proteins in wheat versus rice, we know that rice does not have all the amino acids that it's required. So it's an incomplete protein. And so if people feed only on rice, their brain is not getting the amount of protein, quality protein it requires to grow, versus wheat, which is a complete source of protein. It has all 20 amino acids. So from a nutritional point of view, if we look strictly at wheat and rice, of course, the Western world that fed on wheat, actually, I don't want to say grew a bigger brain, but had a complete source of protein with all the amino acid versus the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that different staples, and you could add corn to that, which actually is missing an amino acid that if you don't get it from somewhere else, you'll get a horrible disease called pellagra. That those vary, but of course, society supplement with other foods that compensate for that. So, you know, they talk about these nutritional packages. And often cereals or staples will spread with the other items that complete the nutritional package. But then, of course, sometimes those other items fall out, and the poorest people end up reliant only on the staple. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a real issue.
Thanks, Mariah. Great question, and particularly as we're talking about how literacy changes the brain, you're talking about how obviously nutrition changes how the brain develops. Could I bring you in now, Lashazar, with your question, please? Thank you, Joe.
Sure, thanks for the opportunity, Louis. Hi, Joseph. Hi, everyone. My name is Lachazar, and I'm a PhD candidate in marketing based in Germany. I use evolutionary psychology to explain different phenomena in marketing and advertising. I have two questions for you. The first one being, are there behaviors that are observed in different parts across the globe, so cross-culturally, and don't have a genetic component? This is the first one. And the second one is, what are the limitations of the evolutionary approach according to you? This is something that you can really help me with in my dissertation that I'm currently wrapping up. Thanks.
Sure. Let me just clarify the first question. So a behavior that doesn't have a genetic foundation?
Yeah, but is still commonly observed across different societies and places.
Yeah, I mean, there must be tons of simple behaviors that you have to do as a product of growing up in a particular place. So something like, something like making fire, of course, appears everywhere. And we have some genetic adaptations for making fire, but we may not have any behavioral adaptations. So one of the problems with the gene question is that the way I think of it is every behavior can be addressed within an evolutionary framework. It's just sometimes the explanation for the behavior involves some kind of cultural learning process where we have evolved capacities to learn from others. So that's where the evolution comes from. There are genes which make humans much different from chimpanzees and much better at acquiring, storing, organizing information they learn from others. That then gives rise to a whole range of behaviors, which may not have any particular link to in other words, there was no gene selected for those behaviors. But of course, there's a lot. I mean, you have hands and stuff. If you use your hands for it, then there's some genes that help you do it because there's the genes that build your hands. But so that allows us to put all kinds of behaviors into an evolutionary framework, and it puts everything on the same epistemological footing. So you might have some behaviors, like I talked about these taboos on cousin marriage. There's no reason to think there are genes for taboos on cousin marriage, but there does seem to be some innate incest aversion in humans. That as a consequence of growing up in close proximity to members of the opposite sex, we get this this aversion, and then we can extend the intuitions that come from that aversion to other areas. So in some societies, you can you marry certain cousins, and you have taboos on marrying other cousins, and you can extend the incest to those other taboos, and that's often how people thought of it. What the Catholic Church did is it extended those incest aversions to your spouse's siblings, so our in-laws. That means in canon law, and so that's a kind of an incest extension. So yeah, so I think once you're in a cultural evolutionary framework, you can think about lots of behaviors that are purely culturally learned and follow the causal chain back to a genetic evolutionary process. Was that just your first question, or was there a second question? Sorry, I got lost on my first question.
The second one is, what are, according to you, the biggest limitations of the evolutionary approach?
Oh, the limitations? Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's my preferred framework. Probably the shortcomings at this point would be to integrate more insights from cognitive science, to more fully integrate methodology. So some of my colleagues within the evolutionary field haven't yet been sold on the value of rich ethnography, which as I mentioned earlier. And also there's a lot of interesting and I think valuable tools from economics. So, I'm interested in integrating utility function calculations into a cultural, evolutionary, and genetic framework where your preferences and beliefs are influenced by some kind of cultural, evolutionary learning dynamic. So those are just some thoughts.
Thanks so much for that great question, Lashiza. I think we have time for one more question. Priyanka, you had a question relating to something that came up personally in your class. Would you like to share, Priyanka?
Sure. Hi, I'm a social cognitive psychologist, and I'm currently doing an MA in social anthropology. So yesterday in a theoretical approaches to social anthropology class, we were studying about Bourdieu. And the one thing that I asked is, what about interdisciplinary methodology and theoretically combining anthropology and psychology, sociology, and evolutionary perspectives to, actually understand behavior and context? To which the professor responded, and I'm a big one for mixed methodology, and that's what I'm trying to do. It's not going well with the professors. They were like, interdisciplinary is only good in idea, flawed and fraught in application, for qual and quant data by nature cannot be combined, is what I got told. I know you touched upon this in the beginning, so I just wanted to ask, would you agree, or is there a way to make it work, and what is that way?
Well, I mean, I guess I feel like I've been doing that and combining those things for my whole career. So a lot of times so the way I do it is I'm laying in my hammock in the village, or I'm observing something that's actually going on, or I'm doing interviews with people on some other topic, and I run across some interesting insight. One example would be, I was having dinner with a Fijian family, and there was a delicious turtle was being served. And I was thinking how tasty the turtle was. And I noticed that one of my Fijian friends, Mariani, wasn't eating the turtle. And I asked her in Fijian why she wasn't eating the turtle. And she said, "Oh, I'm pregnant." And I realized, oh, there's a pregnancy taboo. And this then led to a whole research project showing how these taboos are actually an adaptive set of prohibitions that prevent women from eating fish that are high in ciguatera-toxin. So fish that live on reefs eat a lot of other fish, and it has this toxin in it, which can be bad for pregnant and nursing women. But that's just a case where living in the village led to this whole research project. But then I turned it into a quantitative research project. We did interviews, we had questions, we asked women about they ate, we got a complete list of the taboos, we went to the medical literature to search for the ways that this might affect pregnancy and breastfeeding. So it became a very quantitative study, but it began with a qualitative insight that came from living life in the village. And I've done lots of my work on cooperation has the same kind of feel to it, where I was trying to understand what led to cooperation. And people said and did things which cued off new ideas that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. But then I turned it into a piece of psychology where I have experiments, I'm doing vignettes, that kind of thing. Yeah. And then, and I can use stories. So I use stories from real life in the village, modify them a bit, and then incorporate them into vignettes, and then do them in other villages. So the vignettes have a real feel because the ideas come from village life. And so they're widely usable. But you couldn't have written a vignette unless you'd spent some time in the village and elicited people's experience and had a more qualitative thing. So I guess I just, I guess I have a different point of view. I just really think those things enrich each other and reinforce each other.
So why the taboo in traditional universities? It's really difficult. Like when I did my MSc social cognition at UCL, they were all about like, if you go to India, go to the anthropology department. And now that I'm in the anthropology department at SOAS, they are like, if you want to bring in evolution, go to the psychology department. And it's like that.
Yeah, I mean, I know how you feel. It's definitely a problem. I mean, so again, I mentioned this ethnographic approach. So I think of disciplines as kind of tribes, and they speak a certain language. You have to learn to speak their dialect. They have a certain way of convincing them. So there's a kind of epistemological set of norms. When I convince economists, I focus on the identification. I run regressions. I've got to get an instrumental variable. If you know any economics, you know what I'm talking about. But if I'm talking to cultural anthropologists, I'm going to talk about ethnographic stories and, in-depth, long interviews that I did with people. As psychologists, I'm just going to show a lot of experiments. So it is rough going. It is rough going, and you know, there's always these kind of, but I guess the key is to learn how to speak the language of the different disciplines.
I want to integrate the languages.
Thanks so much for your question, Priyanka. I think we're all absolutely loving your enthusiasm. You suddenly just, the whole group lit up as soon as you started talking. That was fantastic. And thanks for your super answers, Joe. We're getting close to the hour now, so we are going to have to wrap up. It's been an absolute brilliant opportunity to hear from you, and you're very kind to have joined us. I haven't put any questions myself, which I usually do. I just want to say that when I read, I'm going to read from the book here, The Case of Literacy illustrates why so many psychologists and neuroscientists have broadly misread their experimental results and repeatedly made incorrect inferences about human brains. I had a bit of a personal crisis myself with all the new questions that suddenly came flooding into my head, but I think it's great that we are all questioning everything. And I think that's certainly what you've brought to the meeting today, Joseph. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to hand back to Prakash now to wrap up.
Thank you all for coming and joining in. Thank you so much, Professor Joe. Louis is fantastic as always. So if there is just one book that we could read, and you know, we all started primarily as a book club and then we developed into a behavioral science club. But books are very close to us. And if there's just one book we could recommend for this entire year, if you have to just get one book, I think the weirdest people in the world is the book. Please get your hands on a copy of it, hard copy, Kindle, Amazon, whichever way you want it. Read it, write about it, talk to your friends about it. It's a fantastic book. The stories which are there out there, I mean, I'm looking forward to very much talking with my friends, my clients, and my peers with the book. And I want to say lines like, there is a connection between Martin Luther King hanging up his 99 theses and my brain changing the way it is changed compared to my grandfather. Amazing stories like that all throughout the book. Thank you so much, everyone. Professor, all yours. Any parting words, any parting advice from you to us?
Well, thanks. It was great to be with you. A fantastic set of questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for all our loyal members, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, Joe. Thanks,
Stay safe, everyone. Wear your mask.
Thanks, everyone, for your great questions.